I was 5 years old when Adam Walsh went missing. For those of you unfamiliar with the name, Adam Walsh was a 6-year-old little boy who disappeared from a Florida department store in 1981. A couple of weeks later, his severed head was found in a canal about 130 miles from where he was kidnapped. I remember hearing about it, but I was way too young to fully understand what had happened. In 1983, a made-for-TV movie about Adam's story was released. Millions of viewers across the country tuned in, including my family and I. I was a little older by then, although not by much. Obviously, I was still a little fuzzy on the details, but I was old enough to understand something really bad had happened to Adam. It scared me, but I was assured by my parents that what happened to Adam took place somewhere really far away, and the terrible person who hurt him was also somewhere really far away. This gave me some comfort, because in my mind, things like this only happened in other places. A few years later, my sense of security was shattered when an 8-year-old Tucson girl went missing. Her name was Vicki Lynn Hoskinson. Vicki Lynn vanished after going on a bike ride near her home. A 28-year-old man with a criminal history of child kidnapping and child molestation was taken into custody by the FBI in Texas and charged with the kidnapping of Vicki Lynn 10 days later. Eyewitnesses had placed Frank Jarvis Atwood in Vicki Lynn's neighborhood the day she disappeared. Investigators would go on to match the paint from her bike to paint marks found on Atwood's bumper. Also, damage found on his car's gravel pan was discovered to be caused by one of the pedals of Vicki Lynn's bike. Months later, a hiker discovered a human skull of a child in the Tucson desert. Dental records confirmed the remains were Vicki Lynn's. Frank Jarvis Atwood was charged with first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 1987. To this day, he maintains his innocence. The Vicki Lynn Hoskinson case affected an entire generation of Tucson kids, including myself. Suddenly, there was an influx of police officers, counselors, and advocacy groups coming into schools to talk to us about stranger danger. Atwood became the face of that danger, a real-life boogeyman, a monster. Admittedly, I think my anxiety about the whole thing became more intense because Vicki Lynn was someone my family knew. Vicki's grandmother and my grandmother were friends. So I remember the phone calls, and the crying, and the unmeasurable fear and paranoia that was felt in my home because of this tragedy. I've never forgotten Adam's story or Vicki Lynn's. In today's episode, I will be discussing another missing child case, one that wasn't so highly publicized, but just as tragic and shocking. Coming up next, the unsolved murder case of Robert Craig Stevens, and the mysterious cases of Diana Vicari and Charles Morgan. Welcome to Season 2 of El Presidio Project.
Coming to you from the dark side of the old Pueblo, this is El Presidio Project, strange tales of Tucson and beyond.
What's going on, everybody? Dini here, sending you some social distancing greetings from my little nerd cave somewhere in downtown Tucson. I hope you're all doing well and surviving all the craziness happening right now. During this quarantine lockdown, I've been able to find the time to write some podcast episodes for you to hopefully enjoy at some point to help you pass the time during this COVID crisis. Now, I know things are looking pretty bleak out there right now, and I guess I should be writing and recording about more cheerful things. But this podcast isn't about puppies and rainbows. It's about scary things, including true crime, which is the subject of today's episode. And on that note, I will be talking about some pretty serious stuff. So just a heads up, if you're feeling a little bummed out right now, this might not be the episode for you. Maybe sit this one out and come back to it at a later time. But if you're anything like me and don't mind listening to some really dark history even when the world has gone completely insane, then by all means, grab your favorite quarantine snack or drink, sit back and have a listen. I now present you with Tucson Unsolved. Littletown, a neighborhood located on Tucson's south side, became the focus of a missing persons investigation during the fall of 1979. Similar to the Vicki Lynn Hoskinson case, Robert Craig Stevens, a Sunnyside Junior High honor roll student, went missing after going for a bike ride near his home. For 2 days, search and rescue teams from Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, the U.S. Border Patrol, and the Pima County Sheriff's Department swept the area near Stevens' home. Helicopters, search dogs, officers on horseback, nearly 100 people in total. Nothing. It was as if Craig Stevens had disappeared off the face of the earth. 2 weeks after his September 30th disappearance, the body of the 13-year-old boy was discovered about 400 yards from his home near the Triple T truck stop. His bike was located nearby and found in an upright position. An autopsy revealed that Stevens had been strangled to death. So, I first heard about this case sometime last year from a coworker of mine who lived in Littletown when this happened. Who was Robert Craig Stevens? Why hadn't I heard about this case before? After a quick internet search, I found an article written in 2010 published by the Arizona Daily Star. There was a picture of Craig, blonde, really sweet smile, along with a story about his disappearance and murder. The first thing that stood out to me was the distance from his home to where his body was found. 400 yards. That's less than a quarter of a mile away. How is it possible all these search and rescue teams, land and air, found nothing after a 2-day search? How did the helicopters miss the bike in plain view, still in an upright position? Was Craig killed somewhere else and then brought back to the spot where he was found? Was there a push to try to interview as many people as they could who came in and out of the Triple T truck stop around the time he disappeared? I had so many questions and unfortunately very little information available to me. The second thing that stood out was the news article mentioned that a year later, a well-known child predator was arrested in California and was a potential suspect in Greg's murder. But the Pima County Sheriff's Department wouldn't pay for the expenses to send one of their detectives out there to question the suspect. This information totally blew me away. I didn't understand. How in the world do you have a potential suspect in an unsolved murder case of a child and just sort of throw up your hands and say, well, we're not paying for a trip to California for someone to go talk to this guy? That's completely insane. And to be fair, maybe the sheriff's department was in a bad financial state. I don't know what their travel budget was 40 years ago. But even so, this person should have been looked at immediately. So I did a little more digging and found out 8 years later, this would place the timeline at 1988. A Tucson detective was assigned to the Stevens case and was finally given approval to travel, this time to New Jersey, to question the same suspect from before. A man named Malcolm Joseph Robbins Jr. Robbins had confessed to killing boys in Texas, Maine, California, and New Jersey between December of 1979 and November of 1980. The victims were between the ages of 6 and 17. During a 3-hour interview, Robbins admitted to being in Arizona when Craig Stevens disappeared. He also stated that he was traveling with another man at the time, but he didn't give any further information, at least not according to the article I read. The detective who conducted the interview would later say he believed Robbins was holding back information about the Stevens case. No charges have ever been filed. As of this recording, the murder of young Craig Stevens has gone unsolved for 41 years. Just a little under the span of my entire lifetime. If you know anything about this case that would help investigators solve this 41-year-old mystery, please consider coming forward with that information. The second case I'm about to discuss is probably one of the most gruesome murders in Tucson history. On October 24, 1992, the severed arms of a female were found in a dumpster near downtown Tucson. The victim was later identified as 19-year-old Diana Vicari, a Pima Community College student. Diana was last seen in the Tucson Convention Center parking lot after a concert sometime after midnight on October 23rd. Her mother reported her missing the following day, eerily around the same time the young woman's remains were found. The murder of Diana Vicari has haunted Tucson for nearly 30 years, for a number of reasons. Obviously, the grisly discovery of her remains, for one, but also the mystery surrounding the entire case. The rest of her body has never been found. A murder weapon has never been found. The location where she was dismembered has never been found. And perhaps more unsettling, her killer has never been found. At least, not beyond a reasonable doubt. 5 years after Vicari's death, a 35-year-old man serving time in Utah for brutally assaulting his father became the prime suspect in the Vicari murder and was eventually extradited to Arizona. Lemuel Prion, once a Tucson resident, was a convicted rapist who had a history of openly discussing his desire to murder women. Sometimes he'd even sing about it, out loud on his front lawn while his neighbors walked by. In 1993, his father warned the Utah police that his son was quite possibly a serial killer and feared that he had committed a terrible crime in Tucson. After Prion began to talk about hacking up a female with a machete and burying her out in the desert. Concerned by this statement made by Prion's father, the Utah police contacted Tucson authorities shortly after. Turns out, Lemuel Prion was living in Tucson when Vicari was murdered. According to news reports, he was living and working at a nursing home facility located a couple of blocks away from where Vicari's abandoned car was found. Soon after the news of Vicari's murder was reported, Prion moved his family, his father and brother, out of Tucson and took off to Utah. Furthermore, a witness came forward and told authorities he had seen Prion with Vicari at the New Orleans Lounge, a local bar, the night she disappeared. So here we have a violent convicted rapist who didn't hide his desire to kill women, seen with the victim shortly before her disappearance, who just happened to live nearby the location where the victim's abandoned car was found. And another red flag, Prion once took a friend to the sound studio located a few yards away from where Vicari's remains were found, so he was familiar with the area. Alarm bells, right? Of course. But were authorities able to provide direct evidence that Lemuel Prion murdered Diana Vicari? The answer is no. As I said earlier, the murder weapon has never been found. Fingerprints, there were 6 found in the bag where Vicari's severed arms were found. 3 belonged to the woman who found the bag. The other 3, not Prion's. As far as the claim Prion lived nearby where Vicari's car was found, that was eventually debunked by the defense. Prion did work and live at the nursing home located a few blocks away from where her car was found, but he didn't start working there until October 29th, 5 days after Vakari's remains were discovered. Also, the witness who identified Prion as being the man Vakari was seen with at the New Orleans lounge didn't positively ID him until after he had seen Prion's photo in a Tucson Weekly article, which named Prion as the suspect. Despite all of this, and despite another major error on behalf of the court, which I will get to in a minute, Lemuel Prion was found guilty of the murder of Diana Vakari in 1999 and sentenced to death. But the mystery didn't end there. 3 years later, in 2002, the first-degree murder charge against Prion was dismissed for the following reasons. 1, a lack of evidence that directly linked Prion to the murder. 2, Prion was tried for 2 separate cases, the murder of Vakari and the sexual assault of a local prostitute, at the same time. There was never a connection between the two. Therefore, they argued he shouldn't have been tried for both at once. And number 3, the defense was not allowed to present circumstantial evidence that indicated another suspect had committed the murder. I won't name the other suspect because he's never officially been charged, so I'll refer to him as suspect number 2. Suspect number 2 knew and worked with Diana Vakari. He was a known sexual harasser with a violent temper who had been accused of attempting to rape a female co-worker at his apartment once. And speaking of apartments, suspect number 2 rented a new one the day Vakari went missing. It was near the location where Diana's abandoned car was found. And it was also near his other place of work, the New Orleans lounge, the same bar the witness had claimed to have seen Vakari with Prion. Suspect number 2 denied being there the night Vakari disappeared when questioned by police. But the doorman on duty stated the only reason Vakari was allowed in the bar was because she specifically asked to speak with suspect number 2. Vakari was under the age of 21 and technically not allowed to be in the bar because she was only 19. The next morning after Vakari's disappearance, suspect number 2 showed up to work looking so, quote, disheveled and disoriented. He was fired on the spot. None of this information was allowed to be submitted at Prion's trial. So 2 suspects, one with a dismissed charge, the other with none. No direct evidence linking either one of them to the crime. Were Prion or suspect number 2 so incredibly methodical that they got away with committing one of the most gruesome murders in Tucson history? Well, depending on who you ask, the answer is absolutely. But let's say for the sake of argument, based on the lack of evidence, that neither one of them committed the crime. After 28 years, then the question still remains. If Lemuel Prion and suspect number 2 didn't murder Diana Vakari, then who did? Unfortunately, we may never know. The final case I'm about to talk about was once featured in the primetime series Unsolved Mysteries. 39-year-old Tucson businessman, Mason, and father of 4, Charles Morgan, went missing for 3 days during the spring of 1977. In the early morning hours of March 25th, he returned home with one hell of a story to tell. Well, more accurately, a story to write about. You see, Charles Morgan came home that night unable to speak. According to his wife, Ruth, Charles showed up at their door around 2 a.m. He was unsteady on his feet, only wearing one shoe. A plastic zip cuff wrapped around one of his ankles. His hands were bound as well. Frightened and confused, Ruth attempted to question her husband, but all Charles could do was frantically point to his throat. Once the plastic zip cuff around his wrist was removed, Charles was able to communicate using a pen and writing pad. He wrote down that he had been abducted and heavily drugged. Ruth immediately offered to call the police, but Charles refused by jotting down an ominous warning. If the police were called, they would find out and kill them all. He never revealed to his wife who they were. Even more puzzling, Charles noted his anonymous abductors had taken his United States Treasury ID. Charles Morgan was in the real estate escrow business. In fact, he was the president of statewide escrow service in Tucson. At no point in his life had he ever worked for the U.S. Treasury Department, at least not to his wife's knowledge. Less than 3 months later, Mr. Morgan disappeared once again. Only this time, he didn't come home. On June 18, 1977, Charles Morgan's body was found in the desert 15 miles east of Sells, Arizona. He had been shot in the head. In the weeks leading up to his final disappearance, Mr. Morgan purchased various handguns and a bulletproof vest, which he wore everywhere he went. He also stayed away from his home and took up temporary residence at a few West Side motels, where he met with an unidentified woman. During the investigation of his death, his female companion told police Mr. Morgan had shown her a briefcase full of cash, an estimated $60,000, and confided in her that there was a contract out on his life. Retaliation for testimony he had given regarding a bank fraud case. Mr. Morgan's attorney would later confirm his client had given secret testimony to the Attorney General's office a few weeks before he went missing. Adding more to the mystery, a few days before Mr. Morgan's body was found, Ruth Morgan received a phone call from an unidentified woman, the same woman who Charles had met with at a local motel. The anonymous female caller offered Ruth some words of comfort. "Chuck is all right," she said. Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. This Bible reference would be linked to Mr. Morgan once again, after his body was found. Up until this point, everything about this case is just weird, but it gets even weirder. For whatever reason, Charles Morgan had a $2 bill clipped to his underwear the day he died. Written on the front of the bill, in his handwriting, was the same Bible reference the female caller had shared with Ruth Morgan. Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. Why did this specific Bible reference keep popping up in this case? One theory is Mr. Morgan was an active Mason. Ecclesiastes 12 is very popular among members because of its symbolism and probably for other reasons I'm not aware of. In Christianity, the book of Ecclesiastes can be found in the Old Testament. Chapter 12, verses 1-8 basically talk about the difficulties associated with getting older, and how one should embrace and remember God while they're young and not wait until they're in the final stages of their life to do so. Maybe this Bible reference gave Mr. Morgan some sense of comfort, which is why the unidentified woman mentioned it during her phone call, and why he had the chapter and verses on this specific Bible reference written on the $2 bill found on his person. This would still be a little odd, but it at least makes some sort of sense. The only problem is, there were other things written on that $2 bill that no one has been able to figure out the meaning of for over 4 decades. On the back of the $2 bill, which shows an engraved rendition of a famous art piece known as Declaration of Independence, there was a hand-drawn map of sorts showing roads leading to the tiny border town of Sasabe, Arizona, about an hour or so away from the desert location where his body was found. In addition, the founding fathers at the forefront of the image were numbered 1-7. On the front of the $2 bill, 7 Spanish surnames, or last names, were written in alphabetical order from A to G. Acevedo, Bejarano, Cajero, Duarte, Encinas, Fuente, Gradillas. What was in Sasabe, Arizona? Why were these historical figures numbered 1 through 7? What was the meaning behind these 7 last names written in alphabetical order? Who knows? And no disrespect to the deceased, but I think we can all agree here that this is really weird. But wait, there's more. Charles Morgan's body was found near his car. Investigators discovered a pair of sunglasses, not his, in the front seat along with a map with directions to the exact spot where he was killed. Various guns were found as well. One, a .357 Magnum, found on the ground, which turned out to be the weapon that killed him. A stash of plastic zip cuffs or ties, the same type Mr. Morgan was wearing when he returned home from his abduction, were found in his trunk. And finally, a single extracted tooth, wrapped in a white handkerchief, was found in the backseat of his car. The tooth was confirmed to be Mr. Morgan's. Just a quick side note, there's a mention of grinders in Ecclesiastes 12. Grinders in this context means teeth. As I stated earlier, Charles Morgan died from a single gunshot wound to the head. There were no fingerprints on the gun found at the scene. In August of 1977, the Pima County Sheriff's Department ruled Mr. Morgan's death as a suicide and closed the case. I have a million questions about this mystery, but the one that screams out to me the most is, how does a person shoot themselves in the head and leave no fingerprints afterward? If you're disturbed enough to go out into the middle of the desert and kill yourself, I would think leaving behind your fingerprints wouldn't be too much of a concern. Still, suicide, not murder, was the final verdict in the death of Charles Morgan. Now, before I wrap this episode up, I'd like to mention a few other things. Shortly after Mr. Morgan's death, 2 men identifying themselves as FBI agents to Ruth Morgan ransacked the widow's home. They never said what they were looking for. Years later, an investigative journalist who worked for the series Unsolved Mysteries tried to access records related to the Morgan case via the Freedom of Information Act. The FBI denied having any records on anyone named Charles Morgan. It's important to know about our history, even when it comes to disturbing cases like these. Robert Craig Stevens, Diana Vaccari, Charles Morgan, and all those who have been victims of violence are worth knowing about. They were once part of our community, and their stories, as tragic as they are, should be remembered. Please visit 88crime.org if you'd like to learn more about the victims of unsolved cases in our community. This concludes this true crime episode of El Presidio Project. If you have any comments related to any of the cases I spoke about today, feel free to post them in the El Presidio Project Facebook page. Stay safe out there, everybody. Be well. Until next time, bye-bye.